The war in Ukraine has had a profound and devastating impact on the country, touching all aspects of society. One of the most visible and damaging effects of the conflict has been on Ukraine's infrastructure. This destruction has not only affected the day-to-day lives of Ukrainian citizens but has also altered the country's ability to function as a whole. From housing and transportation to energy systems, the war has decimated many of the critical infrastructures that are vital for Ukraine's survival and recovery. In this video, we will explore the scale and scope of the damage, the sectors most affected, and how this destruction is reshaping Ukraine's future. Ukraine has been embroiled in conflict since 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and separatists began fighting in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. However, the full-scale invasion launched in 2022 escalated the conflict to an unprecedented level. The war quickly became one of the most destructive in Europe since World War II, with consequences for every corner of Ukraine. A key aspect of modern warfare is the targeting of infrastructure, which serves multiple strategic purposes. Not only does it degrade the enemy's ability to wage war, but it also puts pressure on the civilian population, destabilizing regions and creating massive waves of displacement. In Ukraine, this tactic has been particularly pronounced. From the outset of the conflict, the damage to infrastructure has been staggering. Cities like Mariupol, Kharkiv, and Severodonetsk have been reduced to rubble. Critical infrastructures such as power plants, water facilities, and communication networks have been systematically targeted, leaving millions without essential services. As of mid-2023, the Ukrainian government estimated that over $150 billion worth of damage had been done to the country's infrastructure. This includes homes, roads, bridges, airports, railways, hospitals, schools, and factories. Perhaps the most personal and widespread damage has been to housing and urban areas. Cities across the country have been severely damaged, with many areas unrecognizable due to the intensity of shelling and missile strikes. In cities like Mariupol, once home to nearly 500,000 people, the destruction is near total. Entire neighborhoods have been leveled, leaving behind a landscape of broken buildings and charred remnants of once thriving communities. In Kyiv, Kharkiv, and other major cities, residential buildings have also been hit. This has displaced millions of people, creating a humanitarian crisis as people have fled both within Ukraine and across its borders. According to estimates by the United Nations, over 12 million people have been displaced either internally or as refugees abroad. The sheer scale of this displacement has put immense strain on Ukraine's capacity to house and support its population. Rebuilding homes will be one of the most significant challenges Ukraine faces after the war. The process will require enormous resources, coordination, and time. Furthermore, many of the areas worst affected by the war may remain uninhabitable for years due to unexploded ordnance and continued instability. Transportation infrastructure has also been a prime target in the conflict, with far-reaching consequences for Ukraine's economy and mobility. Roads, bridges, and railways have been heavily damaged, impeding the movement of goods, military equipment, and civilians. Bridges, in particular, have been repeatedly targeted by both sides of the conflict. Destroying key crossings has disrupted the supply chains necessary for both military operations and civilian life. In many cases, the destruction of bridges has isolated communities, cutting them off from aid and evacuation routes. This has compounded the already dire humanitarian situation in some areas. The rail network, which is critical for moving supplies across the country, has been severely impacted as well. Before the war, Ukraine's railways were a lifeline, not just for domestic transportation but also for exporting goods to Europe and beyond. With tracks damaged and stations destroyed, the capacity to transport goods like grain, one of Ukraine's key exports, has been significantly reduced. Restoring the transportation network will be a key part of rebuilding the country. Without functioning roads and railways, it will be nearly impossible to revitalize the economy or adequately respond to the ongoing needs of the population. One of the most critical areas of infrastructure damage has been to Ukraine's energy systems. From the beginning of the conflict, energy infrastructure, including power plants, substations, and transmission lines, has been a frequent target. The goal appears to be not only to degrade Ukraine's military capabilities but also to make life as difficult as possible for civilians. In the winter of 2022-2023, this tactic became especially devastating. With temperatures plunging below freezing, Russian strikes on power stations and heating plants left millions without electricity or heat. In cities like Kyiv, entire districts were plunged into darkness as critical infrastructure was knocked offline. Ukraine's nuclear power plants have also been a significant point of concern. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest, has been the site of intense fighting and shelling. The risks of a nuclear catastrophe remain high, as any damage to the plant's reactors or containment structures could lead to a large-scale disaster affecting not only Ukraine but surrounding countries. Rebuilding the energy grid will be a monumental task. In the short term, Ukraine has relied on emergency repairs and external support from the international community. But fully restoring the energy infrastructure will require billions of dollars in investment and years of work. The war has also severely impacted water supply and sanitation infrastructure, leading to widespread shortages of clean water. In many regions, water treatment plants, pumping stations, and pipelines have been damaged or destroyed, leaving millions without access to safe drinking water. In the Donbas region, the situation is particularly dire. Years of conflict have already taken a toll on the water supply, but the full-scale invasion has exacerbated the crisis. In Mariupol, the destruction of water infrastructure contributed to a major humanitarian disaster as residents were left without access to potable water for months. The lack of clean water has led to the spread of waterborne diseases and increased the risk of public health crises in some of the most affected areas. International organizations have stepped in to provide emergency water supplies, but the long-term solution will require rebuilding the damaged infrastructure and ensuring that water systems are resilient against future disruptions. Modern infrastructure is not just physical, it also includes the digital systems that underpin much of daily life and economic activity. In Ukraine, the war has severely impacted communications networks, including the internet, mobile phone services, and broadcasting stations. Cyber attacks have been another significant element of the war. Both sides have used cyber warfare as a means of disrupting each other's operations and spreading misinformation. For Ukraine, this has meant frequent attacks on critical infrastructure, including energy grids, government websites, and financial institutions. The destruction of communications infrastructure has made it difficult for civilians to stay informed and connected, particularly in areas cut off by the fighting. Additionally, the lack of reliable communication has complicated efforts to coordinate humanitarian aid and evacuations. Rebuilding Ukraine's digital infrastructure will be essential for the country's long-term recovery. It will also involve strengthening cybersecurity to prevent future attacks and ensure the resilience of critical systems. The war has not spared Ukraine's health and education infrastructure. Hospitals, clinics, and schools have been repeatedly targeted, leaving millions without access to essential services. In cities like Kharkiv and Mariupol, hospitals have been directly hit by artillery and airstrikes. Medical staff have struggled to care for the wounded in makeshift facilities, often without electricity, running water, or adequate supplies. The targeting of healthcare infrastructure has exacerbated the humanitarian crisis and led to significant loss of life. Similarly, Ukraine's education system has been severely disrupted. Schools and universities have been destroyed or damaged, forcing students to continue their education remotely or in temporary facilities. For many children, the war has meant years of interrupted schooling, which will have long-term consequences for the country's future development. Rebuilding the healthcare and education sectors will require a concerted effort by both the Ukrainian government and the international community. Hospitals and schools will need to be rebuilt, staff retrained, and systems modernized to ensure that Ukrainians have access to the services they need to recover and thrive. Rebuilding Ukraine's infrastructure will be a massive and complex task, one that will take years, if not decades, to complete. The cost of reconstruction is likely to exceed hundreds of billions of dollars, and the Ukrainian government will need significant support from international partners, including financial aid, technical expertise, and coordination. Some steps are already being taken to plan for Ukraine's recovery. International donors have pledged aid, and organizations like the European Union, the United Nations, and the World Bank are working with Ukraine to assess the damage and develop a strategy for rebuilding. However, the road to recovery is fraught with challenges. The ongoing conflict means that some areas remain too dangerous for reconstruction to begin. Even once the war ends, Ukraine will need to navigate political, social, and economic hurdles to ensure that rebuilding efforts are effective and sustainable. The impact of the war on Ukraine's infrastructure has been devastating. From housing and transportation to energy systems and digital networks, every aspect of the country's infrastructure has been damaged. The long-term effects of this destruction will be felt for years to come, as Ukraine faces the daunting task of rebuilding from the ashes. However, despite the scale of the damage, Ukraine has shown remarkable resilience. With the support of the international community and the focus on recovery, there is hope that the country can rebuild stronger and more resilient than before. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more updates on the situation in Ukraine.